Today, I'm particularly delighted to welcome and introduce Nicholas Burns, who is the Roy and Barbara Goodman Family Professor of the Practice of Diplomacy and International Relations at the Harvard Kennedy School. Professor Burns is also the founder and faculty chair of the Future of Diplomacy Project and faculty chair of the Project on Europe and the Transatlantic Relationship. He serves on the board of directors of the Kennedy School's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, is a faculty affiliate of the Middle East Initiative, and is a faculty associate at Harvard's Weatherhead Center for International Affairs. Prior to joining Harvard's faculty, Professor Burns served in the United States government as a Foreign Service officer for 27 years, where he was the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs and the US Ambassador to NATO, among other roles. Professor Burns, thank you for your connection and commitment to Harvard and the alumni community, and also for joining us today. Please read Professor Burns's full biography on his faculty page. As you will soon learn, his scholarship, career, and service are extraordinary. It is my pleasure to welcome Nicholas Burns to talk with us about promoting a more effective response to the COVID-19 crisis. Without further ado, Professor Nicholas Burns, I welcome you to the virtual stage.
Well, thank you very much, and good morning from Massachusetts, and greetings to everybody who's online this morning, to the Crimson Society, to all of those conducting a reunion this year, celebrating a reunion, and to all alums. I'm delighted to be here, and I must say, this is the most unusual commencement eve in Harvard's history. In every other year since the mid-17th century, Harvard students, as you know, and faculty and deans and alumni have gathered in Harvard Yard to congregate and commemorate and celebrate and congratulate. Today and tomorrow, however, are Harvard Firsts, a disaggregated commencement. All of us zooming in from our sanctuaries all over the United States and the world. We are together, but we're also separate. And it's just a shame we can't be in the Lowell Lecture Hall this morning, as I know all of us were looking forward to very, very much. And yet, it is still commencement. Harvard has done well, I think extraordinarily well, since we all left campus in a hurry over 1 3 or 4 day period in the middle of March 2.5 months ago. We went to recreate a university, in this case online. And I can report to you that our students took to this very well. They were flexible, they were imperturbable, they were of good cheer. I spent the last 2.5 months with them online with about 150 students in 2 separate classes. We continued to learn, we continued to conduct research, we continued to write, we continued to debate the big questions, and we carried on the pursuit, the essential mandate of the university, and that's the pursuit of knowledge. You'd be proud of our students for how they adjusted, particularly, of course, our senior college students who will not be together in Harvard Yard today and tomorrow, particularly the graduate students that I've been teaching at the Harvard Kennedy School, Harvard Business School, and Harvard Law School. The faculty rose to the challenge, and the faculty had to discover new ways of teaching. And I think some of those ways we may want to continue even when students and faculty return to campus. And I finally wanted to say how much I've admired our president, Larry Bacow, our provost, Dr. Alan Garber, the members of the corporation, the deans. They've been good and steady leaders. They've made the right decisions. They've been appropriately careful about the health of everyone on campus. And I think all of us have much to be thankful for the good leadership of this university. That's a brief report. You may have wondered what had happened in Harvard if you've been away from campus for the past several months. A brief report from me. What I wanted to talk to you about this morning, and I'm looking forward to engage in conversation with you, is how we can all work together around the world to effect a much better and more cohesive response to the COVID-19 crisis, as well as to the global economic crisis. And I wanted to make 3 major points this morning. And then I look forward to questions, to discussion, to debate, and to your comments. I have 3 observations about what's happened to the world over the last 5 months now, since the pandemic broke out and raged through Wuhan, and then Iran, and then Europe, and now the United States and every other part of the world. My first comment, the pandemic and the global economic crisis are certainly the most significant challenges that the world has faced since the Second World War. They are, in a way, the first true global crises that unite every country, and there are 195 nation states in the world, and in many ways unite every single human being, each of the 7.7 billion of us on Earth. They're the most significant disruptive force in our society and in the rest of the world in our memory. They're testing all of us, every level of government, every business, every university, as Harvard has discovered, every nonprofit, every family, and each one of us individually. You all know how unprecedented the economic crisis has been. The economic numbers released just here in the United States by our Labor Department are absolutely crushing. They describe the worst economic crisis, without exception, since the Great Depression. Over 30 million Americans have lost their jobs in the month of April alone, compared to compared to 8.7 million people who lost their jobs in the Great Recession of 2008 and 2009. Unemployment right now is approaching 15%. Chairman Jay Powell of the Fed has speculated publicly just in the last 2 weeks that unemployment could reach 20 to 25% by next month alone. That would be the highest level of unemployment since 1933. Only 51% of Americans have a job, the lowest percentage in American history. This has also been, as you well know, the fastest economic collapse in our history. On March 1st of this year, just under 3 months ago, we had an unemployment rate of 3.5%. The International Monetary Fund is predicting a 3% decline in global growth in 2020, a 5 to 6% decline in American GDP, a 7.4% decline in the GDP of the European Union, and the EU is our largest trading partner. So we all should expect a deep recession here in the United States, in the European Union, in China, in Japan, and elsewhere. And think of our budget deficit, the ability of a second Trump term or a first Biden term to contend with these dual crises. Our budget deficit has tripled in the last 2 months. That's the government budget deficit, to over $3 trillion. And our national debt is skyrocketing. The next president, and probably the president after that, and maybe the president who follows, are going to deal with massive debt problems and deficit problems well into the next decade of the 2030s. These numbers are a warning about our immediate future. Thankfully, many Americans will begin to return to work in the coming months as we reopen the economy. But the actual recovery will likely take many years. And unfortunately, the poor will be hit the hardest. Bill Gates is predicting that the great majority of global dead, when the coronavirus is finally and mercifully through, will be in the global south, among the poorest peoples of the world. That's just the economic numbers. But you also know about the dimensions of the pandemic. According to the New York Times, with nearly 100,000 Americans dead, the US, with just 5% of the global population, has lost nearly 1/3 of the global dead. 6,304 from Massachusetts alone. We've been hit very hard here and still are being hit hard here in Massachusetts. The average global death rate is 34 people per 1 million. The US death rate is 232 people per 1 million. There's a natural human tension in some ways to even underestimate the impact of the tsunami that's just hit us. But we should all expect that some aspects of life, as we have known it in the pre-coronavirus world, will long ago, in February and early March of this year, life is going to change forever. We're never going to go back to that life and society that we had in the early months of this calendar year. We should expect, if history is our guide, rapid and permanent change. Change in how universities are run, how students study, how mass transit and air travel will have to recreate themselves just in the next year or two. Changes in the demand for healthcare because healthcare in the United States, unfortunately, is attached to jobs, not to individuals. And to see millions of Americans lose their healthcare at a time of the greatest public health scare in the memory of most everyone alive here has been truly frightening. How many of us will choose to dine out in the months to come, or board an airplane, or board Amtrak, or even travel from one state to another? We're facing, and this is my first point, the most difficult set of challenges in our lifetime, and certainly as a society and as a world. My second point, we're 5 months now into the crisis. I think we can see the difference that leadership makes. We can see the difference that good leadership makes, and we can see the consequences of poor leadership. With this in mind, we might ask which governments have performed most effectively. And I think by all accounts, the jury is in. The most impressive governments are mainly from mid-sized countries, nearly all democracies, by the way, who detected the threat of the pandemic early, who followed the data, who listened to empirical thought, who followed the advice of epidemiologists, who then took rapid and early decisions to lock down their societies, who tested their populations on an extensive scale, and who followed the data. South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand, Israel, Austria, Denmark, and especially Germany seem to be the governments that have acted most effectively on behalf of their own citizens. I single out Germany because it's by far the largest among them, with a population of over 80 million people. Last year's commencement speaker in Harvard Yard was Chancellor Angela Merkel. And a lot of us were in Harvard Yard that day to listen to her. We saw a woman who was a trained physicist, who has enormous respect for the university, who has enormous respect for expertise and experts, who put aside political considerations and decided that she would lead through science. And the results are there for all to see. On the other side of the ledger, 4 of the strongest countries in the world, the United States, China, Brazil, and now India, and I would add the European Union to that mix, they've all had major problems. China has embarked on a significant propaganda campaign to describe itself as heroic in fighting the disease and helping others. And I think we can all respect the difficult decisions that President Xi Jinping made early in the crisis, the extraordinary steps the Chinese leadership took, appropriate ones, to protect their society, to test their society, to isolate people. But Beijing did lie to the entire world about the health crisis in Wuhan for much of January. I am not insinuating or stating here that I agree with Secretary Pompeo or President Trump that we should call this the Wuhan virus. I think that's entirely counterproductive. I'm also not insinuating, and I don't believe, that the Chinese government created this virus, as some of the other conspiracy theorists have speculated. But there's no question that the Chinese government withheld critical information about the severity of the crisis in those critical early weeks. And that put everyone from the World Health Organization to every country in the world, to all of us as individuals, at great risk. China's still not being transparent. They're blocking international efforts to create an investigation of what went wrong so that we around the world might learn the lessons that when the second wave hits of the coronavirus or when the next pandemic hits. It turns out that authoritarian dictatorships actually arrest their citizens who ask questions like that. What went wrong? What could we have done better? And these kinds of governments stonewall foreigners who want to learn from mistakes so as not to repeat them in the future. The United States, I have to say, and it's painful for me to say this because I worked for most of my professional life in the federal government, we've seen the failure of the federal government to lead decisively and consistently and effectively, and at times even honestly. Many of our governors led brilliantly in both red and blue states. Some did not. At home, I think the United States needs, but probably best when the crisis is past, We need to form a 9/11 style commission of leaders of unimpeachable integrity from different parts of our society, from both political parties, who can tell us what went wrong so that we are better prepared the next time. COVID-19 is the fourth pandemic that's hit the world in the last 17 years. SARS in 2003, H1N1 in 2009, the Ebola crisis in 2014, and now the coronavirus in 2020. There's every reason to believe that pandemics will be in the future of the American people and of people around the world. And so globally, the United States needs to step up, and we need to help lead the world to study the disease, to share data, to integrate research for a vaccine, to decide the really difficult question, how is it going to be possible to distribute a vaccine, if one is found, equitably to 7.7 billion people, potentially? Pandemics will be in our future. We need to be much better prepared in the United States the next time around. And that's my second point. Leadership really matters. These are Olympian challenges. It's very difficult to be at any level of government, city, county, state, national, global right now, but we need better leadership. My third point is that the world needs to work more effectively in common cause on both the economic crisis and on the pandemic in the months and the years ahead. On the health front, there is really no alternative right now to the World Health Organization. The World Health Organization has not received high marks from across the world for its stumbles in January and February. But to walk away now and withdraw funds, as the United States is currently doing, is like defunding the fire department in the middle of the fire. And we also live in a glass house here in the United States. Our own Center for Disease Control in Atlanta, part of the federal government, well, they failed on testing in the critical months of February and March. That hurt us. It set us back. We haven't frankly caught up. Tough questions need to be asked of both the WHO and the CDC, but after the crisis is through, we need them both to function now. On the economic front, we need to mobilize the G7 countries, and particularly the G20. This is the group of the 20 largest economies in the world. Back in 2008, in September and October, when the Great Recession hit us hard, President George W. Bush and President Nicolas Sarkozy of France decided to assemble the G20. And for months, and this extended into President Obama's first year in office, we all around the world were integrated. The leaders met constantly. They were aligning their fiscal and monetary policies to prevent the Great Recession from turning into a Great Depression. There has been nothing like that now. The central bankers, like Jay Powell, have worked together, but the presidents and prime ministers have not. And if we don't have better global cooperation on crises that are truly global in nature, we're all going to suffer. And I think the most dispiriting aspect of this crisis for me, and I wouldn't have predicted this back in early March, is to see how little the United States and China have been able to cooperate. And that's putting it kindly. They have both been consumed throughout the crisis by belittling the other, by competing for who's going to lead, by competing for who has the better story or the better results in the middle of a global pandemic. China is challenging the United States, belittling the United States publicly, and the United States has returned the favor from statements made by President Trump and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. We are the two largest countries with greatest global capacity. We could be organizing the rest of the world to protect citizens around the world, and yet China and the United States are not doing it. That certainly has to change. We need better global leadership and more concerted global action. I thought that Pope Francis said it best 2 months ago. You may remember before Palm Sunday, he stood in St. Peter's Square alone in the rain, and he said, we find ourselves all in the same boat on the pandemic, on the economic crisis, and we all need to pull on the same oar. And I thought that was leadership to describe this extraordinary situation in which we find ourselves. Before we go to questions, let me end on hope, because we are celebrating our commencement. I don't want to leave you all thoroughly depressed this morning. There's always hope, and we've certainly seen hope on the front lines in our towns, in our cities, and across the country. We see it in our hospitals. We see it in our health clinics, in our doctors, nurses, orderlies, custodial staff, emergency responders. We've seen a lot of hope in Republican governors like Larry Hogan in Maryland and Charlie Baker here in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and Mike DeWine in Ohio. We've seen hope in the early actions of Governor Gavin Newsom to take our largest state and put it into a lockdown earlier than nearly any other. And we've certainly seen a lot of hope in Andrew Cuomo, the governor of New York. There's even a silver lining. It actually could have been worse. As a lot of experts have been saying, if this had been a worldwide Ebola pandemic, the casualties, the number of infected, the number dead, could likely have been far worse than even the terrible, terrible losses that we've suffered here in the US and around the world. And I think for Americans, we can look back on our history, we can find hope that will help us explain what's happened, give us the courage to move forward. Certainly, Americans have faced more devastating crises in the past. The Civil War was far more destructive to our society than what has happened to us over the last 2.5 months. The combination of the Great Depression and World War II was a much more daunting challenge for those Americans, I think, than even our generation of Americans. I would even say the Civil Rights Crisis of the 1950s and 1960s was more deeply existential about what it means to be an American. We came through all of them. We'll come through these two crises. And a major positive note for me has been to have seen how strong and considerate and resilient and patriotic our students are, our faculty is, our society is over the last several months. We'll get through this. And then we have the responsibility to rebuild and renew together, red and blue states, Republican and Democrat, rebuild and renew the United States. I hope that leaves you a little bit of hope this morning. Let's have a discussion. As always, I tell my students, if you disagree, fire back, let me know. We can have a good discussion about any of the issues that I've talked about, or if you're interested in general commentary on foreign policy, we can do that too. Thanks so much for listening to me, and I'm looking forward to a good conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Burns, for that incisive analysis and that dose of much needed hope. This is Heather from the HAA, and I'll be calling on some folks who have questions. Up first, it looks like we have a question from Ellen Messer from the Harvard Radcliffe College class of 1970. Ellen, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question, please?
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you for your talk and your final words of inspiration. My question concerns some of your opening remarks, where you commented on what were successful versus unsuccessful, relatively unsuccessful responses by nations with their national leaders. So my question is, how have Germany and other successful countries with responsible leaders handled issues of health disparities and anti-immigrant politics in response to COVID-19 pandemic?
Ellen, thank you very much. I've been watching Chancellor Merkel because I admire her. I was really taken by the way she acquitted herself on campus when she was with us for about 48 hours a year ago this week. I think if you took a private poll, a secret poll of the G20 leaders, all those powerful people, Xi Jinping, Narendra Modi, Donald Trump, Bolsonaro, and you asked, who do you respect the most in a private poll, I think Merkel would win. We have a daughter, one of our daughters, my wife and I have 3 daughters, is living in Berlin. She works there for a business. She decided to ride out the pandemic in Germany, and she's reported to us calm, order, very strong public health system that serves everybody, massive testing, clear communications from the government, and from Merkel herself, calm, dispassionate, objective, data-driven analysis for the German people. I actually watched a speech that she gave. I don't speak German, unfortunately, so it was translated, in which she very calmly, but in a very complex and detailed way, described from a scientific standpoint why social distancing is so important and how diseases can be transmitted. And I thought, would it be wonderful to have such leadership in every country of the world? I'm not familiar with the details of the public health crisis in Germany, of how their massive immigrant population since 2015, they've taken in over 1 million, as you know, refugees from Syria and Afghanistan. I don't know the details on how they've treated people who may not yet be citizens, but knowing a little bit about how Europe works, the EU and most of those states, they tend to be pretty comprehensive in treating citizens and non-citizens alike. So thank you for your question.
So up next, looks like we have a question from Massachusetts State Senator Mike Barrett. Mike, would you like to, oh, and he's with the Harvard College class of 1970. Mike, would you like to unmute yourself?
Thank you very much. How you doing, Cuz?
I'm doing well, cousin. How are you?
My question, can you hear me okay?
I hear you fine, Mike. Yeah.
Has to do with how we can integrate climate responses into our responses to the economic and healthcare crisis that you have described so well. How can we do all three over the next 2 or 3, 5, 10 years?
Well, first I've got to say, and people will understand why I do this, Senator Barrett and I are cousins. We come from a very large Irish Catholic family, which its base has been in Worcester, Massachusetts for the last century. And I believe there are about more than 60 of us on our mother's side alone. My mother, Mike's grandfather. We're very proud of Mike. Mike, after leaving Harvard, as a lot of you know, was a state representative for many years from Cambridge, now a state senator living in Lexington. I follow Mike avidly. He's been a leading voice for climate change in Massachusetts and nationally, and we're proud of him. And I want to thank Mike for his service to our community, and congratulations on your 50th reunion at Harvard. Mike, the cover of The Economist that just arrived in our house a couple of days ago is "Crush the Climate Curve." Take advantage of the COVID-19 crisis and take every step we can to reduce carbon emissions around the world. And I think that's a challenge that the whole world has to embrace. It means defeating coal. It's interesting in the United States, and Senator Mike Barrett knows this better than I do, but we're seeing appreciable declines in the use of coal because coal is being outpointed in the marketplace, and outpointed not just by natural gas, but also by renewables, particularly wind power in states like Texas, which is now the largest wind power state in the United States. Our emissions are declining here in the United States, but we need to do more. I think, Mike, it's an embarrassment to me, as I'm sure it is to you, that the United States is the only country in the world that is not now an adherent to the Paris Climate Change Agreement of 2015. I'm supporting Joe Biden. I don't want to make this political or partisan at all, but I'm supporting Joe Biden and I'm advising him because I'm convinced that he'll put us right back in to the heart of the climate change fight around the world if he's elected president and when he takes office next January. And all of us as citizens have to get behind this because we can't deny the science. The science is real and the threat of lasting change, and our kids are going to face this more than us and our grandchildren. It's real. So here's an opportunity to use this coronavirus crisis, the lessons from it, to lessen our dependence on fossil fuels. The real problem, Mike, I think is going to be in 2 places. In India and China, they're both building coal-fired plants by the hundreds. They're all coming online. And there has to be concerted efforts by the European Union, the United States, if we'd rejoin the effort, by Japan, to help push the Chinese and the Indians to be less reliant on fossil fuels, to make the painful, admittedly very painful decisions that we all have to make to change the way we think of energy and think of our future. So I commend that Economist article to you. And again, Mike, thank you for everything you're doing for our state.
Thank you, Senator Barrett, for your question. Up next, we have a question from James Weaver from the college class of 1965. James? James, you should be unmuted. So if you'd like to go ahead and ask your
Okay, there we
question.
go. Thank
There
you
we go.
for your comments. I'm curious, would you speculate for us about the influence of the fact that we are in a presidential election year as to how negatively and or positively this is influencing our overall country's response to this pandemic? I would appreciate that because you have an enormous amount of government experience and can speculate, I believe, in these areas. Thank you for your thoughts.
James, thanks very much, and congratulations on your reunion this year and everybody in your class. I would just, boy, we could probably organize an entire course at Harvard around all these questions. They're a great question. And James, I guess I'd say two things, one global and one national. On the global front, and I'm sorry to report this, but if you're watching the public opinion polls in most of the democratic countries around the world, the credibility of the United States has plummeted. Why? Because for the first time in 75 years since the end of the Second World War, the United States is actively choosing not to lead in a global crisis. And I say that because everyone looks towards us. We're still the strongest country in the world, economically, technologically, militarily. China's strong, but we're the acknowledged global leader, and we're the democratic leader. And with that democracy comes some trust around the world that an authoritarian government like China could never muster. And yet, the United States has not led in the G7 or the G20. We are defunding the WHO to the disappointment of the rest of the world because most countries don't have strong public health systems. They depend on the WHO for guidance, for data, for information, and we're the largest funder. One of my students said to me early in the crisis, I did a big Zoom call with students early in the crisis with several hundred students, and one of the students from Europe said to me, in addition to everything that President Trump is not doing to lead, he said he's had these endless press conferences, and yet there's never a word of sympathy for an Iranian or an Italian or a Spaniard at a time when those three societies were in the crucible. And it's been that lack of leadership that has brought us down. I'm really worried about the declining trust in the United States, even in countries like Australia, one of our closest friends in the world, Germany, which has always been close to the United States since the end of the Second World War. That's my comment on how we are being perceived around the world. I'm worried about what's happening at home. The New York Times had a fascinating article the other day that it said, you know, the greatest number of deaths since early March have largely been in blue states, in big cities like New York and Chicago, and now Los Angeles and Philadelphia and Boston. Crowded cities with highly developed urban transport, with larger refugee and immigrant populations who tend to be poor in the early years of their stay here in the United States. And that may account for a lot of the deaths, as well as the deaths, and this is so tragic, of all those people in veterans' homes and nursing homes. And ordinarily, we'd expect any president to put aside partisan politics and not distinguish between blue and red. But that's what's happening. And I feel that in the response from Washington, we are being actively divided from one another. So in a situation like this, all we can do is take matters into our own hands by showing some care for each other, by not being judgmental, by not being vicious on Twitter, by not castigating red states if you're from a blue state or vice versa. And I think a lot of people are rising to the occasion and trying to accentuate the fact that we're all part of the same nation. And in a crisis, we have to pull together, but we don't have that leadership right now. So I wanted, in my opening comments, I talked about the consequences of good leadership and poor leadership. And I think we've seen a little bit of both here in the United States. Thank you.
Thank you. Up next, we have Lukas Oh from the class of 1990. Lukas, if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask your question. If Lukas is unable to unmute himself, I can ask his question as well. He's curious to know if could the United States end up in an unlock and lockdown cycle while the rest of the world opens up?
That's, I'm not, frankly, the best person to answer that. I'm not an epidemiologist. I have too much respect for public health experts. I just don't have their knowledge. From what you and I have been able to read, there's so much we do not know about the coronavirus. I mean, doctors have been saying to us consistently, and one of my three brothers is a doctor at Children's Hospital Boston, also a professor at Harvard Medical School, and he's been telling me, my brother Jeff Burns, Dr. Jeff Burns, he said, look, there's just a lot we don't know about the coronavirus. We've only been studying it now for 5 to 6 months. He's helping to organize on behalf of Children's Hospital Boston a group of doctors, hundreds of doctors around the world. They've been studying most recently this respiratory ailment that's been affecting infants and young children as a consequence of the coronavirus. And it's hard to map this. And so it's going to take science, funding, persistent pursuit of data for us to have a better understanding to ask your question. But from what you and I are able to read, as I'm a layperson, I don't know about you, if you're like me, we don't know if there's going to be a second wave. We don't know if, as we begin to reopen, we may see a spike in infection rates. That appears to be the case even in Germany. Over the last 2 weeks, that was the case in South Korea and in China, although it's hard to know if the Chinese, frankly, are being open with the rest of the world about the extent of their infections as they've reopened. So as a citizen, I'm just trying to rely on the experts. I have a lot of faith in our governor, Charlie Baker. I think he's a straight shooter. And I like the fact that Governor Baker and Mayor Walsh have been appropriately conservative about reopening. I like the fact that our president, Larry Bacow, is being so careful about how we reopen Harvard. I fully expect us in some way, shape, or form to be online for a while as a university, but it's going to be probably a little bit of both. And I trust our university leadership to make those decisions. So that's the best I can do as a non-public health expert. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to see that we have a question from Ann Eldridge from the Radcliffe class of 1957. She is one of our most dedicated volunteers. Ann, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes, hello, Professor Burns. My question is, do you think that the effect on citizens in the United States and everybody in the United States of losing their health insurance and their health care during this pandemic could provide the momentum for some form of universal health care? I won't call it Medicare for all, but some form of universal health care. Thank you for your comments.
Well, thank you very much, Ann, for your really pertinent question. I've actually been thinking a lot about that. And, if it's possible, and if Senator Barrett, my cousin Mike, is still on the line, I'd be actually happy to hear his response to this, because he's in the legislature and he's in politics and he might have a better sense of it than me. But here's my 2 cents. I think the fact that so many people have lost their jobs and therefore their health insurance, 60 Minutes had a report that millions of people have lost their health insurance just in the last 30 to 60 days because they've lost their jobs. It's fundamentally undemocratic that people are now left at the time of possibly the greatest crisis of their lives, and for their families, for their parents, for their kids, without adequate resources. And those of us who are very, very fortunate to have health insurance then have the ability to have better care. That just doesn't seem right. It doesn't seem ethically responsible as a society. We allow this to happen. And I would expect that, just as we saw in Theodore Roosevelt's time, an age of progressivism about union rights, about child labor laws, about working conditions as a result of the unbridled capitalism of the late 19th century, just as we saw in FDR's New Deal, a huge wave of progressive legislation and the creation of Social Security coming out of the unbridled capitalism of the 1920s. Just as we saw in the Great Society of Lyndon Johnson, a similar wave of progressivism, I wouldn't be surprised if we saw people demand that healthcare be attached to the individual and not to the job as a basic right of every American. Otherwise, we will live in a fundamentally unequal society. But I'd really be anxious to hear what Senator Mike Barrett has to say about this, if he's willing to answer
Uh,
it. And Mike, I don't know if you're still on, but you may be muted.
Hi, Nick. Can you hear me?
I hear you now.
Great question, and I might add great answer. Unfortunately, you can't separate the policy from the politics. So to veer back into politics, if we can elect a Democrat as US president and elect a Democratic Senate and keep a Democratic House, then the ideology, the politics, and the policy will align. And I think we can push for healthcare for everyone. It's still going to be complex because in a lot of states, including Massachusetts, we do have a safety net. We do have a state level healthcare for all. We took part in the ACA, which did a pretty good job. But to make it truly national, we're going to need a political realignment. And then I think we ought to fight like hell for the policy realignment.
Thank you, Mike. And I
Wonderful.
agree with you.
Up next, we have a question from Javier Gonzalez from the class of 1980, celebrating his 40th reunion this year.
Good morning, Professor Burns. Can you hear me?
Good morning, Javier. Yes, I can hear you fine. Thank you.
Thank you. My question is, do you anticipate that in future U.S. presidential administrations, there will be a new agency and a new cabinet position for emerging pathogen and pandemic preparedness? If so, what would be the mission? What would be the resources and scope of this agency?
What a good question. Thank you, Javier. And congratulations on your reunion, and to those of your classmates. I think you're right. In fact, I was teaching, one of the classes I was teaching until 10 days ago was called Great Powers. And we looked at the ability of the most significant powers in the world either to cooperate or not to cooperate. And we also looked at the changes that governments would have to make. And we remembered that after 9/11, the United States government created the position of Director of National Intelligence, which we did not have until then. We created the Department of Homeland Security, which is now next to the Pentagon, the largest department of the federal government. We completely overhauled our intelligence agencies because of the massive failure of both 9/11 and of the Iraq War and the intelligence failure of the Iraq War of 2003. And we overhauled the Pentagon. And that was the work of George W. Bush and Barack Obama and now Donald Trump. I do believe, Javier, that if we look at what has just happened to us, this massive tidal wave that hit us, this tsunami, and to reflect on the 4 pandemics of the last 17 years, I think you'll see Congress in both parties, a Republican president or a Democratic president, Trump or Biden, decide that we have to create a new cabinet agency with significant resources that would combine all the aspects of the programs of the US government, partially from the Department of Health and Human Services, HHS, certainly the Center for Disease Controls, partly our FEMA and USAID. I would advocate the creation of a single federal cabinet level position to coordinate in pandemics and to do 2 things: to look ahead when we're not in pandemic with the best intelligence that we can muster to try to see on the horizon where the challenges are coming from, to integrate us globally with other countries around the world so that we can be ready, and to help coordinate the efforts in the United States once a pandemic hits. It could be worse next time. An Ebola pandemic would be worse than the type of virus that we're facing now. And frankly, my understanding of American history and my own professional life in the federal government tells me that the only institution in the country that can truly lead 330 million people in 50 states is the federal government. The federal government is not backup, as President Trump said. The federal government has to lead. all those Republican and Democratic governors wanted leadership from Washington. What they got was a government that threw the challenge to them and made them compete with each other for N95 masks and ventilators and all the other necessary equipment. Imagine if FDR had tried to run the Second World War like that, and if he had said to Michigan and Ohio and California, you governors and states, you decide how to build hundreds of thousands of tanks and hundreds of thousands of aircraft to win the Second World War. It would have been preposterous. Imagine if Lincoln had said to the Union states in 1861, well, you're all on your own now to fight the Confederacy and we're back up. So I think that's the massive failure. Failure of imagination. I would even say failure of responsibility by the federal government in this crisis. And I say that, and forgive me for being on the soapbox, I think it's a really pertinent issue. Winston Churchill visited Harvard on September 6, 1943, in the middle of the Second World War. And he was given an honorary degree by President Conant. FDR had asked for this. And Churchill addressed the Harvard community in Sanders Theater, and then went out to Tercentenary Theater and addressed a huge crowd, including 6,000 young men and women. They were cadets training to go into the Second World War. And he gave a big speech, and you know what his key line was? The price of greatness is responsibility. He was essentially saying to the Americans 77 years ago, you're now the strongest power in the world. You now need to lead. If you want to be great, you have to be responsible. Well, our federal government needs to be responsible. I think Churchill's admonition at Harvard a long time ago is very, very important for us to reflect on now. Thank you for your question.
Thank you. So our next question comes from a very patient Charles Kimball from the class of 1967. Charles, please go ahead.
Hi, yes, you've discussed how the COVID-19 virus is opening up another significant fissure in US-China relations. Do you think Trump is serious about Huawei, about shutting down any trade, not just ours, but our allies with Huawei? And what do you think about the technological fight that's going on between the two countries?
Well, I think the president has taken some dramatic actions to limit Huawei's access to American technology, but it's also been somewhat inconsistent, kind of a back and forth quality. I think he's used it, and maybe he's smart to do this, President Trump, as leverage against the Chinese in the overall trade negotiations. I would also say, Charles, that this is our competition with China has not become a partisan issue, not. Most Democrats, our senior Democratic leaders, agree with most Republicans that we are now in an entirely competitive phase with China. And very quickly, we're competing, as you say, for technological domination in the AI, biotech, quantum computing spheres. I mean, the big technologies that will govern the 21st century world. We're competing for primacy there. We're competing for military power in the Indo-Pacific as China challenges the United States and our allies, Japan, Australia, our partner, India. We're competing certainly for trade supremacy around the world. China, highly protectionist, and frankly, a China that has been ripping off the intellectual property of the Japanese, the Europeans, and the Americans. And we're even competing ideologically. If you think about Xi Jinping this week, at this very important national congress in Beijing, he's been saying in his speeches, the future is for authoritarianism. We don't believe that. Donald Trump, I hope, doesn't believe that. I don't think any of our leaders believe that. We believe in a democratic future. So there's this big competition underway. It is going to define that US-China competition, define global politics and shake global politics for the next decade or more. And my last word on this would be to say, we've got to be careful. We have to compete. We can't back down and see the Chinese steamroll us across these areas of competition. But we also have to cooperate. We can't do much to fight COVID-19 if we don't cooperate with China. We can't do anything on climate change if we don't cooperate with China and the EU and Japan and India. We can't stabilize a global economy that's reeling if we don't cooperate with China. So we're going to have a balance of competition and cooperation with China. And we need national leaders who can be sophisticated enough in their understanding about power, about diplomacy, to know when to accentuate the competition and when to cut our losses and cooperate. And that's why it's been so disappointing to see the United States and China not cooperate in any way, shape, or form in this huge public health and economic crisis. But I think that's one way to look at the U.S.-China relationship going forward. I don't blame President Trump for this situation at all. In fact, I think he's done some things that are very effective in trying to neutralize the worst aspects of Chinese power. But I don't think the president has shown that kind of dexterity that you'd want in the White House. Thank you.
Let's hear from Nicole Leeds now. She is celebrating her 10th reunion this year. Nicole?
Hi, thanks for the opportunity to ask my question. So one of the things I was really curious about is we watched Australia and New Zealand form essentially a safe bubble between the two of them, where travelers can go back and forth between them, but not to other countries. And I was wondering, in the sort of the sphere of international collaboration, do you expect that we'll see more bubbles like this? Is this what reopening is going to look like, where you sort of end up with cohorts of countries that have safe travel between them? And if so, what would sort of the fault lines be?
Nicole, thank you, and congratulations on your reunion. I would say you're going to see that in some parts of the world. Certainly, you're definitely seeing it right now between a liberal leader in New Zealand and a conservative leader in Australia who worked very well together. Jacinda Ardern, I think, has received some of the highest marks as an effective global national leader during the pandemic, as has Scott Morrison in Australia. You're going to see it in the supranational European Union because the EU was nearly invisible at the beginning of the crisis as those national borders went up that separated Austrians from Germans and Swiss from Italians and the Germans from the Danes, for instance. But now the EU has begun to assert itself, and the EU can, I think, play a helpful coordinating role as people move across borders in the open Schengen regime that regulates the movement of people and workers in the European Union. You should see it, I would say, I don't know if we will, but you should see it in North America. We have in many ways, as you know, a symbiotic economy with Canada and Mexico. We have the largest undefended trade border in the world between the United States and Canada. We have the greatest number of people traveling back and forth across our southern border, obviously from Mexico. It would be highly rational for the Mexican, Canadian, and American governments to be planning together. We need migrant workers from Mexico to power our agribusiness, our agricultural community in the United States. Our farmers know that, our farm state senators know that. So I think there might be common ground between Republicans and Democrats in Washington to think regionally and forgive. I mean, I've been tough on Donald Trump this morning, but I wanted to be honest with you. I don't think he's thinking like that. He is, I think he is a unilateralist. He believes the United States is strongest when we act alone. I think that's a perfectly reasonable way to look at the world of 1820. When we were, 10, 12 million Americans, mainly living along the East Coast in a largely autarkic economy. But now we're 330 million Americans in the most globalized period in global history. So unilateralism doesn't get you very far on the coronavirus or on the economic crisis. I think that's the root of the problem. But I'd like to see us plan on a North American basis.
So we're almost out of time. We have time for about 2 more quick questions. Let's hear next from Elizabeth Block from the class of 1965. Elizabeth?
Yes, science used to be part of what Lewis Hyde would call the gift economy. Scientists worked at universities, they worked in the government, and what they produced was out there for everybody to use. For decades now, science has been monetized. Today, Jonas Salk would patent the polio vaccine. Frederick Banting would patent insulin. Both of those were released free for everyone to use. Do you think that this has contributed to the distrust, even the hatred of science in a large segment of the population.
Elizabeth, thank you very much. And, I guess the first thing I'd say is I just don't know the data on public opinion polls of how Americans are viewing scientists, doctors, nurses. But I know I live where I live in Massachusetts, where there's great regard, high regard for our doctors, nurses, orderlies, medical staff, scientists, experts. And I gather that's true around the country. People can see that the real courage has been shown in the hospitals. And people, our medical professionals, have literally, as you know very well, taken their lives into their hands by going to work every day over the last couple of months. And so it wouldn't surprise me that one of the positive impacts, if we can say that, or positive consequences of the coronavirus is a newfound appreciation for scientists and for doctors, nurses, for people who work in labs, because we depend on them in a pandemic for our lives and for public safety. And the final thing I'd say, Elizabeth, and this is a longer conversation that we could have, Walter Isaacson, another great Harvard graduate, friend of mine, has been preaching, I think correctly, for the last few years. We've got to be very careful about the innovation triangle. It's a larger way of looking at your question. Walter says, what made America great from the Manhattan Project forward in the early 1940s was that the federal government funded basic science research at universities. And ideas were incubated at places like Harvard and MIT and Caltech and Carnegie Mellon and Stanford and University of Illinois. And a lot of those ideas found themselves to the third point in the triangle, government, universities, to the private sector. Walter says that innovation triangle that made us the great technological power is breaking down because the government's no longer funding the way it did basic science research. And Harvard has great ambitions with our science campus, with our School of Engineering coming online in the next year. And we ought to be pushing in our state houses and the Congress for much greater funding for science. I hope we're going to see much greater public appreciation for empirical thought and for data and for the value of experts in our society.
So we are just about out of time, but I would love to sneak in one more question from Vivian Click from the class of 2005. And I think we can use her final question to close us out today. Vivian?
Thank you so much for your comments. I wanted to ask, given your discussion on leadership and credibility of the US, what can we as citizens and diplomats, my family is moving to France, hopefully at the end of this summer, as my husband becomes the naval attaché to France. What can we do on a smaller scale as citizens, as diplomats, to help salvage and bolster both the credibility of our nation and relationships with our allies?
Yeah, thank you. And thank your husband and you for the public service you're going to be doing in Rome. And he is as a military attaché. I think first and foremost, obviously, we should hope to have a president who is willing to lead both at home, and he has to go there first. His first obligation is to defend us. Everybody gets that. But also as a matter of self-interest and of being responsible in the Churchillian sense at Harvard to lead internationally. And we don't have that president right now. I've been working for Joe Biden now for 14 months as an advisor on foreign policy, along with lots and lots of other people. I think he would be that president. And so I think electing him, frankly, is the best thing we can do to repair America's very tatted image overseas. I'm going to be a real homebody right now, electing people like my cousin, Senator Mike Barrett, who's on this phone call, who's really an exemplar of the kind of leadership we need. Joe Kennedy, Charlie Baker, just to be ecumenical for a moment between the two political parties. And we can certainly support those aspects when America does reach out through Special Olympics, through Save the Children, through Catholic Relief Services, all the great American NGOs that have their tentacles spread around the world and really are the best expression of our society and of the generosity of America and of Americans to the rest of the world. And so I think both in terms of public policy from Washington and local policy, we can make sure that we are both paying attention to what we do here at home, but also what we must do overseas. And I think the thing that lingers with me most from my Harvard teaching experience online was that young European student. Can you also just show a little sympathy to the rest of the world? And a little sympathy, a little commiseration. We're all in the same boat together, Pope Francis, excuse me. I think that will show the kinder side of America that we know is here and that exemplifies our society. So it's been a great pleasure to be with all of you today. I want to congratulate all of you who are in reunion classes. We're all sorry we can't be. We're supposed to be in Lowell Theater. Sorry we can't be at graduation tomorrow. It's always such a magnificent affair. I'm going to be online watching our president and confer the degrees, and looking forward to what President Larry Backhouse says, and certainly looking forward to what Marty Barron, our commencement speaker, says when he's hosted by the Harvard Alumni Association tomorrow. So thank you all. Harvard's continuing. We're in good shape. Thank you for your support for our university.